So what I want you to listen for is there's 15 variations. Where's the 16th variation? We got some big divisions by tonality, but how might we group the variations, right? Whenever we had a set of variations, whether it's a continuous one like this, or whether it's a theme and variations with distinct pauses, composers usually make them into larger forms by grouping them, right? So where do you hear the groupings in this piece, right? And then we got the groupings and then the 16th variation. I'll give you one other thing to think about. One of Rachmaninoff's well-known quotes is he, of course, we know he was an active performer, and I often use this as a quote for discussion. He says, it's absolutely critical that a performer knows the culminating moment in any piece, right? He says, this culmination, depending on the actual piece, may be at the end or in the middle. It may be loud or soft, but the performer must know how to approach it with absolute calculation. That's his word, absolute calculation. So here's a simple question I would suggest it's worth asking. Where is this culminating point? And that could be a moment in the music. It could be a passage. You could use the word climax. But the statement itself is one that's interesting to think about. And again, this is usually fills up a whole class for me. Does that apply to all kinds of music or only certain styles, right? Is there a difference between Baroque music in terms of culminating points, classical, romantic, or 20th century? And obviously there are differences. But anyhow, with that in mind, let's listen to it, how you hear these variations grouping, where the culminating points are, and what happens at the end. Right? So I'm going to use the Air Force Band recording, and I do list the recordings of these. And here's a disclaimer now. The recordings I use, I didn't pick out for particular groups. They were either I owned them, which was one, or they were in the College of Music library, right? And they'll see why I need to make that disclaimer as we go through. But this one's good for our purposes. It's a really fast tempo. So. Sorry, this keeps slipping out. I'll find it. Okay, one hearing often is clearly not enough to do this, the exercise I want to do, but I'm assuming you are familiar with it, and since our time is short, let me just cut to a few points then. What I would suggest is we might hear these variations grouping the theme through variations 1 through 2 rather, then 3 through possibly 6, a gradual build-up, what sometimes people refer to in variations as a rhythmic crescendo, keeps building. 6 is kind of interesting. We might hear it as continuing the somewhat heavy style of the punctuated chords in variation 5, and now with the theme in the upper parts and this very active pesante bass line, right? But it certainly is a change in texture. But very clearly the change to dynamics in number 7 is marked, and we might group 7 through 9. Now I apologize as well, this handout didn't copy as well as I'd hoped, but right where I marked rehearsal 9, right, if we're trying to listen for points of closure or groupings we wouldn't want to miss, and I might add, some of this I'm certainly aware is quite obvious. It's just things I think we want to try and be attentive to. And the obvious things are often the most important ones. But that's the first time we get a clear, authentic cadence on that tonic chord, and there's no connection from one variation to the next, right? And that's something else you could look at. There's 2 4-bar phrases here which make an 8-bar theme, and sometimes it's 4/4, sometimes it's 8 bars, right? And the way he shapes the variations, that's yet another element. But at the culminating point, right, now one obvious place the obvious place might be the final fortissimo maestoso section, beginning with number 14. And all we point out is he divided into 3 sections, right? This particular diagram was noted that variation 12, right, was returned to E flat, right? So again, if I said, look at the diagram and decide whether you agree or disagree, you don't have to agree with what I'm saying either, but make sure you're just not mapping on at face value. I think the real measure 12 and 13, or rather variations 12 and 13, are still part of an ongoing process to get somewhere else, right? And I think that's fairly clear, and that particular diagram doesn't quite make that clear with this emphasis on the change in key. Gosh, time's going by quickly. I was going to play a few of the recordings to see how we can do this quickly. So just getting a feel for the overall form of it. And again, you have to make your diagram. You may look at one, but making sure you assimilate that, okay, into the onto your score itself. I think it makes a real difference when I know the piece, right? So when I'm listening to it holistically, so I have an idea. And this is a fairly often cited viewpoint. We want to know the whole piece and understand the detail in relation to the whole piece, right? And just like any performance can have a good sense of this, but not enough attention to detail, or a lot of attention to detail, but not a big sense of the large. I think a good analysis is the same way. You want to balance those things, right? Right. The opening melody brought to mind awareness of shaping a unison line could be something you have to think carefully about. Now, again, you may intuit this very simply. I don't know how to do it, but just before we listen to it, if I had a hand, I wanted to review some of the basic, very basic things about scale degree function that hopefully you were taught. But we know that if we're in E flat, we have these notes, right? One way I introduce the importance of scale degree functions is some notes go to other notes, right? And that's how we hear different scale degrees. So, and I had a handout to show this, but I'm sure you can do it by ear as well. So, if there's our tonic triad. We know that 2 wants to go to 1, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 1, right? Those are very strong tendency tones, right? Or that we can have 2 as a passing tone. We can have 3 passing tones, right? Neighbor tone again, and so forth, right? So, of course, that can vary according to context, but there's some basic things I think we often intuit. Passing tones, especially upward, tend to increase motion, maybe increase tension a little bit. Descending ones maybe release in tension. that upper neighbor tones have a little more attention to them than lower neighbor tones. And again, there's lots of times we could argue the opposite, but these are some things that we find we can intuit. That dissonances, especially stressed ones, accented ones, we should be attentive to, right? So a lot of those things I think we intuit, but if you were not sure how you might want to shape a line, I find thinking about those things is useful. And if we look at the opening melody, I have this nice little Schenkerian sketch, very simple one, right, which you're not going to get to see, and maybe that's just as well. But it's a pretty interesting melody. I hope I can talk through this and it makes sense. And it almost lays out like a Schenkerian sketch, because if you know anything about Schenkerian graphs, Schenker, the basic idea is he was very attentive to melodic structure and which notes ornament structural notes. I mean, in a real simple nutshell, that's it. And when you do Schenkerian graphs, you have open head notes or stem notes are the important notes, right? And non-stemmed notes and colored notes are the ones that are stressed as structural ones. And this melody almost lays out like that. What we can sense and how I read this is the first E flat really is almost like a neighbor tone to that half note F. And the C quarter note is a neighbor tone leading down to the B flat. And that B flat's an important note because it's an important scale degree, but it arpeggiates down, and the E flat in measure 3 is really a neighbor tone to that F, right? And the F falls strongly to the first B flat. And then we have this jump to the C in the second 4-bar phrase, measure 5. That D is an interesting note. It looks like it's going to be a passing tone. And what note should it go to, we expect? Right? At least following the normal tendency of that particular note, we're going to get something like, when I'm playing this as an analysis. All right, so there's that. Then, I mean, we might have expected that D to go to the E flat. And I think it's a really artful melody that jumps from one passing tone to a neighbor tone, F, and back to that B flat. Right now, I don't expect you're going to sit down. I never did, and I took some Schenkerian analysis in undergrad, but I didn't sit down and do graphs, right? But I did sing through melodies, and I tried to think about those things just to get a sense of it. So if we think about that, that may have some import for shape. I had 4 different recordings. I'm going to play just 2. Moving fast, okay.